that you just accept whatever comes across the big eye, the propaganda machine of Big Brother in your living room? You see, Nazi could never be on the right if on the left is socialism and communism. Nazi cannot, absolutely cannot, could never be on the right. For Nazi is simply gutter slang, ladies and gentlemen, for National Socialism. Nazi originated from the German National Socialist Workers' Party. You see, Hitler was a socialist. Hitler nationalized almost everything. He had social programs for everyone and every circumstance. Hitler was engaged in a program of social engineering never before attempted by anyone or any government in the history of the world. Hitler repeatedly made reference to a, quote, new order, end quote, and a, quote, new order of the world, end quote. You see, folks, the so-called New Age movement is nothing new. It actually originated in Nazi Germany, and most of what is extant now as New Age was, in fact, in vogue then. Communism is also a manifestation of socialism. Nazis can only exist on the left just above communism, which, by the way, exhibits more facets of fascism than the Nazis ever did. Murdered more people than the Nazis ever did. But that does not excuse what the Nazis did. Don't get me wrong. What I am trying to do is show you the truth and expose the big lie under which you have been living for so many years. For all of these lies, taken together, are forcing you down on your knees, are propelling you over the cliff toward a death in a world of socialism where you will be enslaved in a cashless system of debt, chained to a computer forever, where ownership of private property is forbidden, and where the school in the community will be merged with the mental health center, and you will be required to attend from birth to grave. Another socialist lie is that fascism is an expression of the right. However, ladies and gentlemen, when one studies history, it is found to have only existed in socialist regimes. Fascism is an expression of control which only exists on the left, because on the left side of the scale is where control lives. It only exists in that place. Although communists and socialists will vehemently deny it, fascism only reaches its full potential in a communist system of government where literally everything is owned and controlled by the state. And the only thing that matters is the welfare of the state. The God is the state, the Father is the state, the provider is the state, and the executioner is the state. If you don't believe it, get out your dictionary. The Webster's Encyclopedic Unabridged Dictionary of the English Language defines fascism as, and I quote verbatim, one, period, sometimes capitalized, a governmental system led by a dictator having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism, regimenting all industry, commerce, etc., and emphasizing an aggressive nationalism and often, but not always, racism. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . believed the communists were nationalistic. Go back and read the rhetoric of the Soviet Union. Read the rhetoric of Cuba. Read the rhetoric of every socialist and communist nation that has ever existed. And you will quickly discover that you are wrong. You say a world government cannot be nationalist? Yes, it can, ladies and gentlemen, and it will. And it is already beginning to show the signs of that. For if you are not in the politically correct frame of mind, where you speak of the world and the world community and the brotherhood of nations as the number one priority, what happens to you? You can mark off one world among the worlds and the stars and the suns and the asteroids in the universe and still be a nationalist. The definition that I just read to you from Webster's Encyclopedic Unabridged Dictionary of the English Language describes not only Hitler's Germany, but the Soviet Union for all of its history, and every other communist regime that has ever existed. But somehow the socialists, Chip Burlett, Southern Poverty Law Center, the Anti-Defamation League, the World Federalists, and many, many others, the United Nations as a body, want us to believe that freedom-loving Americans on the real right are Nazi, fascists, racists, and it simply is not true. All of these little idiots running around calling themselves Nazis and believing that they are on the right and believing that they are for freedom and believing that they support the Constitution for the United States of America are not only lying to you, ladies and gentlemen, they are lying to themselves, which is the worst thing that any human being can ever do. They are nowhere near the center, much less the right. They are firmly on the left, firmly established in that foothold known as socialism, which breeds dictators, which breed fascism. And if you're a Nazi, or you think you're a Nazi, and you're hearing this for the first time, you'd better sit down and think about it, because what I am telling you is the first truth you've ever heard in your life. May I remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that the Soviet Union has a history of persecuting Jews and other minorities. May I remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that you have never seen a black man in the leadership of the Soviet Union ever. May I remind you that the Soviet Union has always benefited its minority states last, when and if they were ever benefited at all. And that is only if you consider the concept of how does, ladies and gentlemen, how does old Chip Burlett, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ADL, the United Nations, the World Federalists, and all of these other people who espouse a socialist New World Order, how do they explain I'm talking about me and you, real Americans, how do they explain our resistance to more regulation and control? How do they explain J.J. Johnson, the black leader of the Ohio Citizens Militia? How do they explain me, William Cooper, one of the foremost leaders of the Patriot and Militia movement, being part Native American and married to a Chinese wife? How do they explain my two top assistants being Filipino? That's right. Michael Aponte and his wife Sharon are Filipino. Americans, solid Americans, understand freedom, liberty, and are ready and willing to die for it, should they be called upon to do so. How do they explain the Jews for the preservation of firearms ownership under the leadership of a real American patriot, Aaron Zellman? How do they explain the many blacks, Hispanics, Jews, Orientals, and others of all races and religions who understand truly freedom and belong to patriot and militia organizations? How do they explain our defense of freedom in behalf of all peoples and religions? How do these fools explain our call for more individual responsibility and accountability for an individual's actions? Well, the answer to all those questions, folks, is they can't, they don't, and they won't. Because to do so will force them to admit that they are wrong and that socialism is wrong. And we are not racists and bigots and terrorists. In fact, exactly the opposite is true. For what we want to give to the population of the world is freedom, responsibility, a sense of self-worth, value, satisfaction, real education, and installation of the truth. What they, on the other hand, wish to bring into the world is total and complete absolute control over every single person upon this earth, from birth until death, for every single moment, every hour, every day, every week, every month, every year of their lives. Shackled in slavery, in a cashless system of debt to a computer forever, where you have to have a card to travel or to get a job or to obtain medical care, where you cannot own even the simplest rudimentary weapon to defend your person and your property, which, by the way, you will have none of, since private property will not be allowed to be owned in the New World Order. In fact, you really don't own it now, although you think you do. How can Chip Burlett, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Anti-Defamation League, the United Nations, the World Federalist, and all the other socialists and socialist organizations call themselves freedom-loving Americans when in fact they support the emerging Gestapo police state and incessantly call for more governmental control over every single facet of our lives? How many of you have really thought about that? How can these people call themselves freedom-loving Americans when they call those who are sworn to protect and defend the Constitution for the United States of America racists and fascists and terrorists, when in fact, ladies and gentlemen, the Constitution is the only document in the history of the world that ever set men and women, including blacks, free? How can they claim to be freedom-loving Americans and call those who are sworn to protect and defend the Constitution for the United States of America racist and fascist and terrorists when the Constitution is the government and the supreme law of this land? If we, who are sworn to protect and defend that document, that government, that law, for the protection of all peoples, of all races and religions, are racists and fascists and terrorists, what, pray tell, does that make them? At the very least, ladies and gentlemen, it makes them guilty of treason. They are, in fact, traitors.